Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos quienes nos acompañan en esta sesión del mes de agosto del Seminario de Historia de las Emociones del Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas de la UNAM, en concordancia con el CIH de la UNAM también. Este es el ciclo abierto de nuestro seminario y hoy tenemos, bueno, el gran honor y alegría de que nos acompañe la doctora emérita Bárbara Rosenwein de Loyola University, a quien agradecemos enormemente haber aceptado participar. Ella es una de las más destacadas historiadoras de las emociones del mundo y estamos realmente agradecidas de que nos acompañe. Welcome to the Institute of Historical Research of UNAM, Bárbara. We are very pleased that you have agreed to participate in this series of lectures that seek to bring English-speaking scholars closer to the Mexican and Latin American public. And we are so pleased to have you. Thank you very much. And le cedo la palabra a también la coordinadora de este seminario, la doctora Estela Roselló, quien dará también la bienvenida y una breve presentación del trabajo de la doctora Rosenwein.
Sí, bueno, pues buenos días a todas, a todos los que nos acompañan por las redes. Buenos días a la doctora Sosenski. Muchas gracias por esta coordinación conjunta que hemos emprendido este semestre con gran éxito y sin duda es una gran alegría tener esta mañana a la doctora Rosenwein con nosotros. I don't know if you understand Spanish, Bárbara, but well, I think you understand. So we are just saying that we are very pleased and very happy and honored about having you with us. And I am going to read a very brief note about your trayectoria. So very briefly, seguramente todos ustedes conocen a la doctora y no necesitamos gran presentación, pero de todas maneras lo voy a hacer. La doctora Rosenwein es profesora emérita de la Universidad de Loyola de Chicago. Desde 2009 ha sido investigadora asociada en el Centro para la Historia y las Emociones de la Universidad Queen Mary de Londres. Además, ha dado conferencias en todo el mundo bajo la línea de investigación de Historia de las Emociones y algunos de sus libros pues, más importantes, por ejemplo, son Love, a History in Five Fantasies, Anger, The Conflicted History of an Emotion. Sus publicaciones reflejan un interés muy importante por la historia de la Edad Media. Entre muchas de sus monografías sobre ese tema se encuentran Be the Neighbor of Saint Peter, The Social Meaning of Clooney's Property, Negociación del Espacio, Poder, Moderación y Privilegios, El pasado de la ira, los usos sociales de una emoción en la Edad Media y, por supuesto, el importantísimo libro de comunidades emocionales en la Alta Edad Media que todos citamos constantemente en nuestros trabajos. Es un concepto sin duda fundamental para hacer historia de las emociones y hoy tenemos también el gusto de anunciar para el público hispanohablante esta nueva publicación que seguramente disfrutaremos mucho de Winter Dreams, A Feelings History of Old Age. Y bueno, ya Bárbara nos contará cómo ha cambiado el título de este nuevo libro, pero pues eso, es un placer y un gusto tenerte aquí esta mañana. Bienvenida a México, bienvenida a América Latina e invitamos a todas las personas que están aquí en la sala y también a las personas que están en redes a que pues no solamente escuchen, sino también puedan participar y preguntar y aprovechar la oportunidad para conversar con una de las grandes historiadoras de esta corriente historiográfica que nos interesa tanto a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias, Bárbara, y una vez más, bienvenida.
Gracias, gracias. Quiero agradecer a Susana Sosenski y Estela Roselló, Soberón, por la invitación a hablarles hoy. Solo lamento tener que hacerlo en inglés. Today I've been asked to speak about the events and ideas that animated my work as a historian of emotions. In fact, it was an unanticipated development. I was a medieval historian long before I became a historian of emotions. However, being any sort of historian is preparation for becoming a historian of emotions, because you learn to ask why questions, and the answers often have to do with feelings in one way or another. Certainly, it led me there. Now I'm going to share my screen so you can see a PowerPoint presentation. I suppose because I always ask the question why is the reason I was invited to chair a conference session on the social construction of anger in 1995. As I listened to the papers presented there, I became aware of the extent to which historians were relying on an old and outmoded model of emotions to divide Western history into two parts: the irrational Middle Ages, followed by the rational era of modernity. This model dated back to the work published in 1939 in German and in English titled The Civilizing Process, or El Proceso de la Civilización in Spanish, by Norbert Elias. In brief, Elias characterized medieval people as childish, impulsive, irrational, out of control, giving in to all their pleasures and lusts, and, moreover, excessively violent. One couldn't even call them emotional because their sentimental lives were so unruly. Modern people are the opposite. Their impulses restrained, their consciences developed. They keep their feelings under control as the price of flourishing in the complex and interdependent world we live in. We may now speak in this modern world of anger instead of fury, love instead of lust. Elias put the start of modernity in the 17th century, or a bit before. I knew that Elias was wrong about the Middle Ages. I thought in the first place of the monks of Cluny, the topic of much of my research at the time. The monks were so careful to control their lusts that they kept a light on in the dormitory all night. Elias wasn't thinking of monks, of course. He had warriors in mind. But even in that case, I knew he was wrong, for medieval warfare was carefully choreographed and hedged about by many rules. What of other emotions? The ultimate purpose of the monastic life, said the rule of Saint Benedict, was love of God. Well, that rule functioned like a set of laws, and thus it's no wonder that in the 12th century, monks as well as clerics in medieval cathedral schools elaborated theories of love that easily rivaled the profundity and complexity of modern thought on the topic. But did monks, warriors, and scholars feel love? Did they feel anger rather than fury? Did they feel sorrow? Listen to the troubadours for the answer. Here is Sercamon writing a lament for Guillaume the 10th, who died on a pilgrimage to Compostela in 1137. So here's a 12th century statement about loving a lord. I feel grief and sorrow and anguish, for I see youth fade, joy diminish, and evil arise since the Count of Poitou died. The honor and glory had ceased that once flowed from Poitou. Note that Sercommon's lament, however full of feelings, invokes them in a way that few modern persons would do. He laments the end of all youth, the ascent of evil everywhere, and the depletion of the fount of all honor and glory. Perhaps you consider his words insincere, though they're probably just as sincere as the words in a eulogy today. But actually, sincerity is less important to an historian than the emotional norms to which the speaker is appealing and inadvertently revealing. Listen to the eulogy given by the Archbishop of Canterbury in 2021 to mourn and give thanks on behalf of Queen Elizabeth. He speaks of his affection and respect for her, and of her grace, strength, courage, and openness. He says nothing about youth and joy, evil and good, or honor and glory. Are those themes implied? You might imagine that they are, and perhaps you'd not be wrong, since Queen Elizabeth and the Archbishop were indeed distant heirs of the traditions of the Count of Poitou and Sercomon. At any rate, the emotions in these two instances of lament are both different and similar. And that is perhaps the first observation that historians of emotions must make. They must realize that while for many people, professional psychologists among them, talk about emotions as if they are universal, hardwired in the brain, and the same in the past as in the present and across all cultures, the facts of history dispute that view. At the same time, we must also recognize that human beings do have something in common, the capacity to experience and express feelings. Of course, I had not thought of any of this at first, but as I came to see that every historian accepted the paradigm of Elias, I decided to try to work out an alternative. In my first article on the topic, I critiqued the reigning view and also suggested a way to investigate emotions of the past and present, to consider that people lived and live in what I called emotional communities, generally coterminous with social communities, however defined. The emotions researcher looking at them should seek to uncover systems of feeling and to ask, what emotions do these communities and the individuals within them define and assess as valuable or harmful to them? What evaluations do they make about others' emotions? What is the nature of the affective bonds that they recognize between men and women, between members of family, and so on? And what are the modes of emotional expression that they expect, encourage, tolerate, or deplore? However, it's one thing to have a general theoretical position, and quite another to put it into practice with real historical materials and all the issues that they pose. I was determined to apply my ideas to the medieval period, but it took me many years to work out a viable methodology. I published a few exploratory articles, and even later, I wrote a book using my new methodology. This initial study, which you see on your screen, concentrated on the Merovingian period, the 6th and 7th centuries, when Roman Gaul was just turning into medieval France. The Merovingian kings were the region's first royal dynasty, and their most important chronicler, Gregory of Tours, was famous for his tales of war, vengeance, and cruelty. And here's why. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Elias saw and thought was a very good illustration of the violence in Gregory of Tours. Rather than emphasize the seemingly wanton violence of the period, I looked at the emotional communities in that period and the feelings that they prized. I pointed out that Gregory's brutal episodes served to point up his group's contrasting emotional emphases, namely on loving bonds among dear friends and family members. Why then did Gregory pepper his account with furious scenes? He was a bishop, and his preoccupation was the salvation of his flock. Love didn't interfere with salvation, hatred did. Gregory focused on violence, not because it gave him the pure joy of giving into his primitive instincts as the civilizing process would have it, but because pointing out sinfulness was part of his job, and also because, no doubt, it was in his self-interest to present himself as a man of peace in the midst of the ungodly. That initial book of mine in the history of emotions was criticized by other researchers in the field. And I should say that by then, and not particularly because I was working in it, but just because I was part of a tide of historical interest in the history of emotions, there were a lot of other researchers in the field. And the criticism that I got was that I treated static groups that didn't change over time. So that comment told me I had to deal with more clearly with historical change. And that in part is why my second book on the topic covered the long period 600 to 1700. And it argued that historical change was both signaled and caused by the ascendance of one emotional community and the marginalization of others. That different emotional communities could exist at the same time, even at the same place. That theories of emotions that were preeminent in each period interacted with how feelings were felt. And they could even promote a certain kind of new emotional community. For example, today, we think that emotions come from the brain. They're in the brain. So neuroscientists are always looking at the different parts of the brain. But earlier centuries associated emotions with the heart. That has a lot to do with how people feel. Then, finally, that the history of emotions transcends the medieval modern divide that is institutionalized in most Western institutions of higher learning. So now let me elucidate my method to study emotional communities. Here it is in brief. First, this is not so easy. Know what you want to study. Normally, it will be a group of some historical importance. For example, the Zapatista guerrillas in Chiapas, or Fiesta culture in San Luis La Paz, or the US occupation army in Mexico, 1846 to 48. Secondly, try to be fairly specific and limited, or you will be overwhelmed by primary sources. Third, gather the sources, written, unwritten, artifacts, information about space and place, and so on. Then, find the words that people in your group relied on when they expressed emotions, and take care to note their contexts, whether moral, interpersonal, or political. Finally, create a list of those words, which should include the bodily movements connected with them, such as grinding teeth, shouting, and weeping. But how can you know that a word expresses an emotion? The worst technique is to impose your own intuition on primary source texts from the past. If I may say so, that was exactly the problem with histories of emotions done before mine. Consider why Norbert Elias labeled medieval people immature. It's because he imposed on them his own standards of emotional expression. But when historians confront topics such as government or religion, they don't imagine they can use modern assumptions about the state or religion, nor should this historian of emotions. For the emotional life of the West, my major field of expertise, I had, luckily, the systematic discussion of the passions, or pathe, in the rhetoric of Aristotle and other ancient philosophers. His discussion included words for passions that may be considered the ancestors of common modern emotions such as anger, fear, and so on. Even though we must also recognize that his passion words included terms that seem far from our emotional vocabulary, such as mildness, which he considered to be a passion. Those observations suggest both the longue durée and change over time, which is exactly what historians look for. Starting with Aristotle, I turned to Latin authors and was able to discover where their lists of emotions coincided with or contradicted. Here you see Alcuin, a Latin writer, contradicted those used by different early medieval communities in various ways and contexts according to their own values and needs. My goal was not simply to draw up lists, but also see which words or group words of words, such as love, amity, affection, were prioritized across the dossier as a whole. That was very exacting work involving observing word counts and word clusters. By the time I finished Generations of Feeling, the history of emotions had become a hot topic internationally, with funding and centers in Australia, Germany, United Kingdom. Not to say I inspired that. A group guided by Ute Frevert at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin became particularly important because its participants worked together in what Jan Plamper called a field tank. And in France, medievalists Damian Bocquet and Peroushka Nagy started a blog and a series of conferences that explored the study of emotions systematically and included input specialists in the sciences. Bocquet and Nagy's program of research, which started in 2006 with the topic of sources and methods, merged with the focus of the Max Planck Institute in 2010, when in their fourth conference, Bocquet and Nagy took up the issue of the body in emotional expression. The body had never been my emphasis, though I certainly talked about emotional gestures, such as kissing, and emotional behaviors, such as crying. But since 2010, the body has become the focus of many historians of emotions. Since it has become, as it were, the new frontier of the history of emotions, let me say that I too have found it very useful in my work. However, I cannot say that it has for me overridden the importance of words and word clusters to understand the salient features of most emotional communities. And because I think that the attitudes people have had about their bodies influence how they experience emotions, I find it incorrect to assume that practices have always been emotional. So, for example, the Stoics of the ancient world denied the importance of shivering with fear or reddening with anger because they judged such things as first movements, not as emotions. Shivers were simply warning signs, telling the Stoics that he or she was on the verge of having an emotion. Then the Stoics reassessed the situation to prevent a real emotion from taking over, at least a bad emotion. They did accept some good emotions. For if the emotion were to happen, take over, they knew that their very being would be overwhelmed by passion, and they would be no better than a witless wild beast. If a robber were to approach a Stoic with a knife, she would consider that the cosmos has its own good reasons for everything that happens, that death is not fearsome, and her attachment to money and even life, both of which are impermanent, is absurd. So in my view, it's more important to say that shivering was not an emotional practice for Stoics than to say that shivering is always evidence of fear. So how do we know what is or is not an emotional practice? Well, we must study what the community says and thinks and values. So I'm not averse to the notion of emotions as practices of the body, but for me, it's a possibility at certain times, in certain circumstances, an adjunct rather than an alternative to my own methods. Meanwhile, it was clear to me that however exciting the field of the history of emotions seemed to be to its practitioners, it had very little impact on the general public. Consider the movie Inside Out, which features the emotions of a little girl. Every emotion embodied as a cartoon has a recognizable color and a characteristic facial expression. Every emotion has one personality, as if emotions are single, definable, and easily recognizable. Many children's books assert this to be the case, teaching youngsters how to recognize a face, to correspond to each emotion, and to pose their faces so that others will know how they feel. This is not innocuous. Held up as the most up-to-date science, it occludes the many ways in which emotions may be named, felt, and expressed. It leads to negative judgments of people who do not play their emotional roles as expected, and it is intolerable for people with facial disfigurements or paralysis. By contrast, the history of emotion shows that we often feel emotions that we can describe only inadequately with the emotional vocabulary that we have, that some emotional lexicons have been much larger than ours, and that feelings often do not come in singletons. Think of the many times in which you've been both angry and sad at the same time. Histories of emotion have the potential to free us from our culture's self-imposed limitations. Those are some of the reasons why I decided to write for the general public rather than only for specialists in the field. In my first such book, I wanted to show how crucial the emotion of anger is in discussions of ethics, and how even seemingly objective scientific views have fed into that tradition. This book allowed me to include a variety of cultures, dating from the time of the Buddha, 5th to 4th centuries BCE, to our own day. Anger, like all emotions, has moral implications. I want to stress this point. Buddha rejected anger absolutely. So did the Stoics. For Buddhists, anger is condemned as the self-destructive error of thinking more of our own suffering than of that of the poor mortal who has hurt us. In the eyes of the Buddha, it's a vice, while compassion for others is the countervailing virtue, the key to ending our endless cycle of births, lives of suffering and death. Suitably modified for the modern era, this idea persists within some emotional communities. However, it seems to be rapidly overtaken by the view that expressing anger, frustration, even fury is good. And the presidential race in the United States is all you need to see how that is happening. Well, after anger, then what? I certainly did not want to start my own version of Inside Out with a separate book taking up each emotion. But when a few years after the book on anger, I decided to write a book on love, some of my friends teased me about starting a series on different emotions. That was not at all my purpose. To be sure, I and many other people consider love an emotion, but few scientists do. Certainly not those who were consulted by Pixar or Inside Out. They identified 5 emotions: sadness, joy, disgust, fear, and anger as key to the child protagonist in the film. Later in that movie sequel, the experts added anxiety, embarrassment, envy, and ennui, which they consider to be the salient emotions that arrive with puberty. Why didn't they consider that loves of one sort or another both delight and trouble us throughout all our lives? Little girls love their parents, and pubescent girls have heartthrobs. Well, they didn't include love because scientists have disqualified it as an emotion. Psychologists are hampered by their very definition of an emotion. They think that an emotion should have a characteristic facial expression and a distinctive physiology that may be tested in a laboratory. It should be a temporary response to external stimuli and only momentary. But love often lasts for longer than a moment. Sometimes it even lasts for a lifetime, and it has no particular facial expression. Historians do not need to find one way to define love. Rather, we need to know how, when, where, and why it was important or unimportant, and in what contexts. We need to understand the reasons for its many definitions and associations. There's no one way to approach this. I chose to trace love's history through the fantasies and stories in which Amor and its heirs have been embedded. I discovered that many of them, these fantasies, endured as basic scripts, even as they change over time. This approach had the advantage of revealing that love is not one thing and never has been, yet, nevertheless, has a core meaning. Here are 5 of the most important ways in which love has been and continues to be felt, or maybe I should say, molded, as being like-minded with another person, as the ecstasy of escaping earthly constraints, as obligation toward another, or more recently, as owing nothing to a beloved because nothing should feel as an obligation if you love. Often, as in number 4, it is an obsessive attachment, which is why some psychologists wish to liken it to an addiction. Or, as 5, it's the opposite, a desire to move on, to flirt, to flit, and to flee. I hypothesize that the experience of love, like every emotion, can be so overwhelming and messy that it is managed via cultural molds that have certain traditional shapes, even as they are changed by every epoch. Individuals, too, may add their own personal touches. Consider, for example, the theme of like-mindedness. Already Homer offered this as love's ideal. When the young and beautiful Nausicaa gave hospitality to the shipwrecked Odysseus, she was attracted to him and wanted to marry him. He, however, demurred, preferring to offer her a blessing instead. May the gods grant to you all that your heart desires, husband, home, and like-mindedness, a precious gift, for there is nothing greater or better ever than when 2 like-minded people are keeping house together, a man and his wife. That was the foundation of Odysseus' own marriage. At its core was a mutually agreeable division of lovemaking and labor allocation between 2 people in utter harmony. Their like-mindedness was not that they thought about the same things in the same way, but that they agreed on the long-term goals that would preserve and augment their household. Okay, like-mindedness is a fantasy, but while it remained the fantasy and an ideal, it meant something very different centuries later to Aristotle, and building on that philosopher's ideas to the Roman statesman and orator Cicero. For them, like-mindedness was the experience of two male best friends who pursued virtue together, living under the same roof when possible, sharing their joys and sorrows, and agreeing in policy, pursuits, and opinions. So close was that agreement that, as Cicero put it, a friend, a true friend, is, as it were, another self. Their souls mingled so fully as almost to make one out of two. And today, the fantasy of like-mindedness lives on, for example, in the dream of finding a soulmate. To bring you fully up to date, I did not follow love with fear or sorrow. Instead, I was struck by the current debate about the age of the US president and his declining abilities. I was intrigued too by the anxieties that were being expressed all about me, about an aging population. That fact that the population is getting older could have aroused any number of emotions. Happiness that grandpa will be around longer, excitement about the glowing future ahead for young people, greed at the thought that there will be still more consumers to buy. In reality, it has been greeted mainly by fear and hand-wringing. I wondered how the elderly themselves felt about being defined as a social bomb, as one book put it. I wanted to explore the emotions connected to old age, both the feelings of those who were not old and those who were. I have only just finished this project, and I today changed the title to Winter Dreams, a historical guide to old age. It is time for me to conclude. The one question that has animated all of my work is why? It led me to emotions, and it led me to think about how and why emotions, as we understand them today, were not always so understood. The question I will leave you with, and hope will animate your own thoughts, is how might the question why help shed light on your own work? Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Bárbara, for this wonderful talk. You leave us with many questions, and we want to have a conversation with you now. So I will ask our audience if they have any questions or comments. And yes, here, for example.
Perdón, tenemos la opción de que hagan sus preguntas en el canal de YouTube donde está transmitiéndose en vivo la conferencia. Para quienes nos acompañan en Zoom, también pueden pedir la palabra a través de Zoom o hacerlo a través del chat. Y tenemos también público presencial y les damos primero la palabra a quienes nos acompañan de manera presencial. Gracias.
Gracias por darme la palabra. Good morning, Professor Rosenwein. Thank you for your conference. My name is Lucia Esposito. I'm a PhD student under the direction of the Professor Rosa Medina Domenic from Spain. She told me to say hello to you on your behalf, on her behalf.
Yes.
And yeah, I have a question about the concept emotional communities. And it's, what do you think are the nuances we as historical researchers have to take into consideration to construct our research, including this concept? I wanted to ask you this because I have been seeing and reading a lot of influence of your concept in social research down in the Gender Studies Institute back in the University of Granada in Spain, from when I'm from. But sometimes we have been seeing that your concept have been applied with presentism, such as you suggested before with as Norbert Elias did. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. What do you have a question that I should answer?
Yeah, did. Sorry. What do you think are the nuances we as historical researchers have to take into consideration to construct our research concept emotional communities?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. And I have thought a little bit about that because emotional community doesn't mean that everybody within that community agrees on every single point. They have different emphases, they have their own individual ways of expressing themselves. And that is something definitely to take into consideration. What I was trying to do with emotional communities was show that, well, the historian can hive off a certain group from an emotional point of view. But then if you're looking just at the internal dynamics of that group, then of course you want to look at some of the differences, which will give you a better sense, really, of the commonality of emotions within that group and where people deviate from that commonality. I did a bit of that with Gregory of Tours and Fortunatus in my first book about the emotional communities of the early Middle Ages, because Fortunatus really only talked or mainly talked about love, love, love. And Gregory of Tours did not talk only about love, love, love. So how could they belong to the same emotional community? And I tried to show how love is important for both of them, but they have different emphases. And if I had more people as part of that group, I would have yet more emphases, which could only enrich the discussion. And so I think that your observation that the emotional researcher needs to look at the nuances is very important.
Muchas gracias. Y bueno, creo que Susana ya Muchas gracias, Bárbara, y muchas gracias por la pregunta. Creo que Susana ha pedido ya que abran sus pantallas y es muchísimo mejor verlos a quienes están acá, a los amigos, a Javier, a Lady, a todas las personas que nos acompañan. Creo que hay más preguntas en el Zoom, no sé.
Tenemos una en el chat de Zoom. I don't know if you can see the question, Professor. No? Well, Matthews Bonfim say, my name is Matthews Bonfim. I newly graduated in history. Can you see it? No. O Matthew, si estás aquí, podrías hacerla también presencialmente.
Claro, les invitamos a que hagan las preguntas para que esto se haga más un diálogo y una conversación y sin intermediarios. Creo que es mucho más bonito aprovechar esta oportunidad. So we can have
Matthew,
this.
no sé si quieres abrir tu micrófono y preguntarle a la profesora Bárbara.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Barbara. My name is Matheus. I'm Brazilian. I'm newly graduated in history here in Ceará. I am researching about a specifically group of singers who were very successful in Brazil during the 70s, military dictatorship. They songs are about the pain of love and involve working class figures. Um, I know. I wanted to know if, as this section is recent compared to the example you use, I would like to know if the methodology will be a little different. How I can start it to think about these issues. I'm new in this issue. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Of course, you have a group that is very much a part of the troubadour tradition, although maybe it doesn't acknowledge that, a tradition which talks about love. The interesting thing is that if that tradition of love is being invoked in a context of military dictatorship or authoritarianism, it might be understood as a kind of rebellion. And you might want to think about how people in that government, if you can find the sources, how they talk about love, because they may talk about it quite differently from your group. And that would be a very interesting way to look at both a kind of intersection, how your group, I forgot the name of your group. What was it? The name of your group? Well, whatever it was, how they interacted with their own context, political context, and yet differentiated themselves from it. That's one way to be thinking about it. I see another.
We have another in YouTube.
Mariela Leo.
Sí, sí, si la quieres, bueno, la voy a leer de Eduardo Martel en YouTube, Bárbara. And he says, thanks. What difference exists, if it exists, between the categories of emotional practice? I remembered Margaret Wetherell, and emotional practice. I remembered the Stearns.
Emotional experience and emotional practice.
Emotional experience, emotional practice, yes.
Well, emotional experience will take in more than just gestures. Emotional practice will be, as you might note from a recent book on enthusiasm, has to do with much more with gestures and how those gestures both express enthusiasm and induce enthusiasm in those who are watching it. And so then you have emotional experiences which could be just internalized. You don't say anything, you don't move, you don't gesture, you don't practice how you're feeling, and you might feel that way at one moment. It might not be the practice of your whole group. You might just feel that fleetingly or something like that. So emotional experience is huge. The emotional practice, at least as I understand it, is mainly the body's movements, the body's activities, the body's practices, walking, running, jumping, so on. And then you asked about Stearns. Well, Stearns, I think you asked about Stearns. Stearns's emotionology is really about idealized emotions, normative emotions, which may or may not influence a group. In the chat, I see Mariela Leo. Do you see?
Es Javier Moscoso. Javier, si quieres.
It's me, Susana. Sorry, but I think Barbara is reading the chat from Zoom.
Sí, sí.
Sí, y la pregunta
Mariela.
es de Javier Moscoso.
Is it my question?
I was wondering if we could.
I think I wrote directly to Barbara. Sorry, I must wrote in some way that I'm so sorry.
Okay,
That's
no
fine.
problem.
Fine.
Javier.
Can you hear me?
Sí,
Yes.
muy bien.
Yes, well, wonderful seeing you all, even, I mean, at a distance. I mean, all the best to my friends there, to Estela, to Susana, and nice to meet you again, Barbara. My question is a double question. It is very simple. It is about gender. I mean, I was wondering which is the role that gender has played in your historical understanding of emotions. And then I was also curious about, I mean, your last book, which I haven't read yet, but it is about old age, but it is always a curiosity. I mean, the Max Planck for the Human Development was also working on emotions in children and in those people who, well, lack, say, language facilities. And I was wondering if you could please say something about these two issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, the first question is, how does gender enter into this? And it must enter into the historian's mind. The historian must ask, is this that I am saying about the emotions of a group true also of the women in that group? Are there women in that group? The historian must always be asking about a women's group. What are the if there are any men in it, what are the men's emotions within it? But sometimes the difference is minor. I think, for example, of the emotions of the levelers of England, the revolution, the pre-revolutionary period in England, where men and women were both involved, and they both emphasized the same emotions because it was for a political cause that they both believed in. So the researcher mustn't jump to the conclusion that women are always going to feel differently than the men, but it is very important for the researcher to think about it. And now your second question was, I'm sorry.
About children and people with language difficulties. Thank you.
So for children, they mainly read children's books and looked at, it was more a question of emotionology. What emotions are children being induced to have, rather than looking at children's, interviewing children about how they felt about such and such. For my old age book, I tried to look at two things, and they're very different, although they interact. One, how do people not old think about the old people of their time? both the old people in their families, but also the old people in general when they see an old person on the street or whatever. So that's, and then how does the old person feel? This is not easy, obviously, but I pulled together poetry, drama, where you do get different points of view, art, sculpture. So I used a huge variety of sources where I could. I used diaries, where I could. I used epitaphs, anything that I could get hold of that would elucidate both the different groups, the different feeling of young and old, but also their interaction, because old people are not separated from the young, those who are not old, and they participate in that same society, and they often share the prejudices of, or the high opinion of those who are viewing them. For example, a friend of mine walked into an assisted living home. She needed to be there. She had to be there. And she said to me, the first thing I thought was, oh, there's just a bunch of old people. This is the modern view. Yeah, yeah. So she felt, yeah, she felt as if she were not old, which a lot of people today, older people today, feel, claim to feel, wish to feel. But that's all part of that same history. You needn't feel that way. You can glory in being old if you have a certain kind of social role that gives you the glory. So, yeah, so it's a different technique.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and Javier too. I have a comment on Susana too, so please.
I want to underline the amount of work, reflection, study that is need to reach the conclusions you have reached, and the way you have put them forward is very helpful. Helpful to students and colleagues that who are approaching to the subject. Thank you very much. We have reached a historical moment where there is a certain obligation to speak and clearly expose our emotions. And I think the example you give of how today about certain cultural productions are establishing one way to express emotions, one single way to express emotions is important, very important, because these forms construct certain types of subjects, subjectivities, and communities. What kind of subjectivities, I don't know, do you think are being constructed by mass media today in this only way to express emotions? What do you think?
Well, I agree with you that there is a certain constriction now in the kinds of emotions that we talk about, and therefore that we feel, because we don't know we're feeling an emotion unless we have a word for it, or we are open up. I think that open up to other possible words, other possible vocabularies. I'm always hopeful for people, that people are endlessly creative and endlessly also willing to buck the norms and find new vocabularies of expression. I don't think we're stuck in an era in which we're all going to feel the same way or look the same way when we feel one way. However, it's easy. It's easy. And it's been always easy. Words like anger, or let's say in Greek, orge, or let's say in the Middle Ages, ira. Those words are so simple. It's so easy to say, I feel anger. And you're crowding into one word a huge amount of feeling, an experience that cannot be compassed really by that little word. So I think that no matter how many emojis we get, we do need to expand our emotional vocabulary. And I think we will. I think we have to, because we're feeling beings. And in that sense, we must. And we're feeling and we're verbal. So we should be able to do that. But it is very hard. Now we have to rebel against a huge weight of propaganda, really. What William Reddy would call an emotional regime. But as William Reddy says, every emotional regime produces dialectically its own emotional refuge, which is going to find a different mode of feeling.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Eduardo Martel has another comment or question, but I am going to ask mine or comment mine. And I'm also very, very interested in your new book. I'm eager to reading it and looking forward to it. And you told us that maybe it will be published in Spanish too, so that would be great. That would be wonderful. And I was thinking about this thing that you were telling us about this adversity, or the way in which one of your candidates to the presidency in the United States kept talking bad about old age, as if being old is bad or is less. But it's interesting who feels old and who doesn't feel old, because he's not the most young person, but he's like, the old are bad and we young are good, or something like that, And I remembered my great-grandmother when I asked her, are you going to wear this dress? No, I will keep that for when I am old. And she was like 87, So I was interested in how these communities, emotional communities, are constructed within and also out of them. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but
yes, but you're asking the question that the whole book is meant to answer. It's a huge question. All I can say is that if I think, for example, about the early Roman Republican period, there was a premium on feeling old, being old, the wisdom of old age, the wrinkles of old age. This was shown. It's not, nowadays, everybody airbrushes their photographs, and they don't be on TikTok to show their wrinkles. I saw the other day a question on X, oh, I see some wrinkles. What cream do you suggest I use? That's nowadays. But in the Roman period, it wasn't the case. And you do get, for example, a very realistic image of Cicero with the wrinkles, with the hairlines, with the jowl that's beginning to sink. So there you have it. Then you get Augustus, a revolution, And how does Augustus present himself? Even in middle age, he is on that prima porta statue, standing there, looking like a young Greek warrior of about 15. Yes? I mean, no, about 21. But I mean, he is projecting an image of self that is youthful. And just to give you another example before I start, think about Mussolini. Before Mussolini, I don't know. Older people in Italy, I think, anyway, they thought were honored. Grandpa was taken care of and so on. What does Mussolini say? You've got to be young. Youth is everything. Even when Mussolini was 50 years old, he airbrushed all the wrinkles and he took a mistress half his age or more than half his age. I mean, these things change. And often they change because of political revolutions like Mussolini brought to Italy or like Augustus, or because other kinds of movements, such as religious movements, come to the fore and their values become most important. But I would say that even think about the fascist period in Italy, even then, there were people who honored their grandparents. This is never one way. No, you always find variation in larger societies, thank goodness. So anyway, but what do I think of the presidential candidate who talked about old age as being a terrible thing? He'll say anything.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Barbara. I think Yolanda in the classroom is asking something, and then we have one last question, right? The the one you told me, but Yolanda, please.
Good afternoon, Professor. I'm quite new with this theme. Would be my first approach to history of emotions, so I have like many questions, really. But I would like to ask, I was reading the other day this essay of Peter Burke, Does Hope Have a History? And he talks about big hope and small hope, referring to emotions that talks about communities and personal small emotions, like personal emotions. So my question is, how do you do the relationship when you study your sources? I mean, your sources are personal, comes from personal emotions, like poetry, like letters, like a novel. But how do you do the relationship between personal emotions and emotions that talk about a whole community or a whole era?
Okay, that is a wonderful question. I have a couple of answers. Let me give you my first, probably most important answer, which is that even personal emotions, when they are expressed in poems, are not just personal, because they are expressed for an audience. They are public. And in letters that often historically letters have been published. And so they are not just written for their recipient. Even a diary is, you would say, just personal. But I would say no, there are two people involved. One is the person writing the diary, and the other is the person who's presenting herself within the diary to herself. So we really got three people. You do not ever have this is my hypothesis, there is no such thing as a personal emotion that is not expressed, even if it's internally expressed. And once it is internally expressed and given a name, it has an audience, you yourself. And so all emotions are really communicative in nature. That's really, I think, their evolutionary importance. Well, I don't know if that helps, but I would not worry about the big distinction between a diary on the one hand and a public document on the other, until you discover that the diary was written by somebody who was completely opposed to the person who composed the public document, in which case you've got the beginnings of thinking about two different emotional communities.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you, Yolanda. We have a last question, and it's Eduardo Martel, who says, the emotional vocabulary is very important for shape the emotional community, but in the methodology, it introduces the body movement. Did you build an emotional community primarily since the body? I mean, the relationship between...
Emotional community primarily based on the body? I don't think you know what that community feels until you have some words from that body that tell it to you, because, raising your hand like this, well, you could be just waving to a friend, or you could be giving the salute of the Nazis, or, you don't know what those gestures mean until you embed them in a context. And once you can do that, then yes, they're very important for defining an emotional community.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that was the last one. So we just want to thank you again very, very much. This has been a wonderful morning for us, and having you in the Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas and in the Seminario de Historia las Emociones, in the CX, which we are building now. Well, we are really pleased and thankful again. Susana, muchísimas gracias. También a Alonso y a Alfredo, que nos han estado ayudando con la transmisión, a todas las personas que han estado aquí esta mañana. Margarita, qué bueno verte por allí también. Susana, no sé.
Sí, thank you very much, Professor Bárbara. We are very pleased to have you here. Bueno, los invitamos para nuestra próxima sesión, que será ya en el mes de septiembre. Tenemos, déjenme confirmarles, sí, tenemos a Katie Berkeley de la Universidad de Glasgow, que va a hablar sobre performance, poder, ética e historia de las emociones. Eso será el día miércoles 25 de septiembre. Ya les estaremos mandando la información, y bueno, seguimos en esta idea de poder divulgar las ideas, los estudios, los trabajos de colegas de habla inglesa a un público mexicano, latinoamericano. Poder establecer esta conversación con ellos es realmente una oportunidad excepcional. Y bueno, seguimos en el Seminario de Historia de las Emociones, y gracias a todos. Hay presencia aquí en el aula de Históricas, hay presencia en el Zoom, hay presencia en YouTube, y el video quedará para ser consultado después. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Bárbara, otra vez. Y gracias a todas y a todos.
Bye.
Bye, bye.